Hi, thanks for coming today to Bruin Voices. My name is Shannon Miller Cox, and after 20 years in law enforcement, I decided to start a nonprofit for harmed women and girls, women coming out of homelessness, trafficking, domestic violence, jails and prisons, and girls that were aging out of DCFS and JJS. What we started to see in the research and with the women that we were serving is that most of them had been harmed long before they ever became mentally ill or addicted or ended up in our criminal justice systems. But they went unnoticed, either because they were poor, children of color, didn't have insurance, came from poor neighborhoods, the blighted zones of the counties, and those are the poorest parts of the counties, where there was heavy enforcement and not a lot of resources there for them to overcome those barriers. So one of Utah's dirty little secrets is that the sexual abuse rates here are higher than the national average. So in the United States, 1 in 4 females will be sexually abused. In Utah, it's 1 in 3. So a third of all of the women and girls in this state will be sexually abused at some point in their life. And for males, it's above the national average. In the United States, 1 in 7 males will be sexually abused. But in Utah, it's 1 in 6. Those are staggering numbers, right? Almost to epidemic levels, right? The other dirty little secret that just jumped above the national average a few years ago was our domestic violence homicide rates. So come ski Utah. It's a beautiful place. We hardly have any violent crime. It's clean, but we rape our children and we kill our wives. It doesn't make for a good ad campaign, does it? So we don't talk about it. I went to a maturation class for my 5th grade daughter the other day, and they didn't even talk about intercourse. They didn't even talk about how babies were made. Somehow the semen got into the egg, and then we started from there. We don't talk about anything that makes us uncomfortable in this community, even in a 5th grade maturation class where we're prepared to have that discussion in a safe place with parents present. We don't talk about it. What we know is that probably half of the children in our schools right now that have ADHD don't have ADHD. They have a backstory. But we have to ask the right questions, right? And not just look at the symptoms. If we do a symptom checklist with these kids, they all have ADHD. Until we ask, what's happening in your life that makes you feel nervous in a classroom, that makes you unable to concentrate? What's happening in your life? And if there's a backstory and we think half of those kids have one, they get to start to survive, right? They get to enable themselves to be resilient because somebody's asking the question and helping them figure out how to overcome those traumas. We know that adverse childhood experiences affects not only how long you live your life, but what happens inside of that life. For every time a child witnesses domestic violence, a parent is incarcerated, they don't have enough food to eat, they experience physical or sexual abuse, they have an ACE score, an adverse childhood experience. And for children that have 5 or more ACE experiences that don't get to survive because nobody's asking those right questions, we know they're going to die 20 to 25 years before their peers that haven't experienced violence. What does that look like? It looks like an increased risk for school dropout. It looks like gang involvement. It looks like anger. It looks like kids in detention. It looks like girls sexually acting out and cutting on themselves and using drugs to self-medicate. It looks like the girls that are being trafficked. It looks like the children in our detention facilities. It looks like the men and women in our prisons. But what if we could change that? What if the brain is pliable and can heal, right? Then children with 5 and 6 and 7 ACE scores that get asked the right questions when they're entering detention facilities, when we know that they've been trafficked, when we know we're intervening as law enforcement with protective services, right? What if we ask the right questions? And we allow children to begin to survive when we see them harmed, right? When we see them struggling in schools, when we see DCFS getting involved, when we see them in our detention facilities and juvenile justice facilities? What if we ask different questions through a different lens? We know that if we start asking through that trauma-informed lens, that women that are in prison for mostly nonviolent offenses started as harmed girls that didn't get seen failing in the classrooms and didn't get seen running away. They just kept taking them home. They didn't ask them why they were running or what they were running from. They just kept taking them home because the bad behavior was the running away. We were asking the wrong questions, just like in the classroom with those ADHD kids. But now we have this lens and we can choose to put it on because the brain can heal from PTSD, right? The brain can heal. We can undo some of those symptoms. We can use eye movement desensitization reprogramming or music or color therapy or dance therapy or neurofeedback. There's all these modalities now that allow the brain to heal as long as the person is in an emotionally and physically safe place. Because if you still need fight, flight, and freeze, your brain's not going to heal. So it starts with creating safe emotional spaces for those children. And how do we do that? We do that with their parents, right? These harmed adults that have ended up incarcerated and homeless and in domestic violence shelters. We know where their harmed children are. They're in their care. They've experienced their parents being incarcerated in domestic violence in their homes, right? They have ACE scores. We know that. We start with those women and those men that are willing to step in with those women. I work mostly with women and girls, and most of them are by themselves walking this walk. We're so upset about where these homeless shelters are going to be, right? Oh, South Salt Lake. How are we going to put the next resource center in South Salt Lake? The jail is there, and there's only this, that, and the other. Let's call it a domestic violence shelter. 155% growth in the family homeless population is because of domestic violence. We turn over 1,000 families away from domestic violence shelters every year in this valley. But we don't want them in our neighborhood. So let's start by calling it what it is. Harmed women and children and harmed men and their children needing a space to be safe emotionally and physically, to start to change the direction of their lives and impact all those generations that come afterwards, right? The first thing we do with harmed women coming out of any place is, are you safe where you're at right now? Because how do they go get a job if they're not safe? If you're in survival mode, how do you start going to treatment and showing up for your visits and sleeping through the night when you're having night terrors if you're not physically and emotionally safe? It all starts with that basic Maslow's theory, right? Of safe housing, shelter, and food and clothing. Through that trauma-informed lens, it looks a little bit different though. It's emotionally and physically safe housing. Because it isn't until you feel safe in that space that you can sleep through the night, show up for appointments in the morning, keep a job, go to school and study. Most of the women I work with are terrified to go back to school because they didn't do well in school settings. But what they didn't understand is that their brain was in fight, flight, and freeze. How do you learn when your brain is scared? You don't. But once they're emotionally and physically safe, they start to grasp new education tools, and we help them get online and start online classes. We help them get FAFSA and get into college. Hell, a flagging certificate can garner $17 an hour to the union. That's a livable wage for women, right? That's a better community that they can live with their children. So it's about creating these trauma-informed lenses, but not just at Journey of Hope for women. We need DWS to have a trauma-informed lens, and they're teaching that to all of their case managers. We need juvenile justice to have a trauma-informed lens and assessment. We need to be asking those children not, you did drugs, you ran around with gang members, you ran away. We need to be saying to these children, what happened to you that you resorted to running away and using drugs and joining a gang family? And asking men and women coming out of prison, what happened to you before you were angry, before you failed out of school, before you got pregnant, right? What happened before you started to use the drugs? And through that trauma-informed lens, we can reshape the way we help individuals and the way we see them. That no longer are we worried about someone walking out of a jail in our community, or for heaven's sake, a homeless shelter that really should be called a domestic violence shelter. Now we see them as harmed individuals that need our support and love and acceptance. And their children, we accept them differently. It takes the whole community changing the lens. I worked in law enforcement for 20 years, and they didn't want us talking about the fact that a third of the men incarcerated in our prison were there for pedophilic acts. And I kept saying, this isn't our issue. This is a community issue. We have to talk about it. This is unheard of in the United States. A third of the men are there for pedophilic acts. We have to say something. Oh no, we can't talk about it. You can't talk about it, right? That's all got to go through the PIO. We know something different now. We know that they started out as harmed children that didn't get to survive and turned into more dangerous adults because they didn't get to survive. So we can undo some of that, right? We can mitigate that pain in the brain. We are resilient. We can change everything about our lives. I work with women that lived in homelessness and were trafficked and gang raped that now are working on purchasing homes and owning businesses. They don't label themselves as a prisoner or an ex-convict. That's a part of their history. It's not who they are today. It's part of their story of survival, but it's not how they frame themselves today. They're resilient, they're survivors, they're mothers, they're in sobriety, they're healthy, they're homeowners. We don't have to stop there. We can change everything. We can change our detention facilities. We can change the way we work with harmed children. We can change our schools so that children are seen through a trauma-informed lens, so that detention settings look more like meditation rooms, so that the brain can heal and they can learn how to self-soothe. We are a resilient people. We can come together in a disaster like no other community. This is one of the most loving, volunteering, beautiful communities in this United States of America. We can turn this around for our children and their children. And it starts with us, talking to our legislators, getting involved in our communities, having conversations in our schools where our children are, having conversations with other parents and other educators about what we're going to do to reshape the institutions that serve our community, that we pay for, that we vote for. You know, it can be a doom and gloom view of the world when you look at the negatives, right? When you look at the dirty little secrets, until you see that there is a way for people to heal and survive and thrive. But it's changing the lens that we see them through. And we can't be scared to have them housed in our communities. We have to be able to love them and empower their children. You have the ability to change the schools where your children are. You have the ability to talk to legislators and community partners. You have the ability to talk to city and county and state officials and to say, this is important to us. We can do this right. We can do this better. It doesn't have to stay the same, but it all starts with us. Not just one voice screaming as loud as I can. It starts with all of us saying, we're not going to quietly go into the night. We're not going to allow our children to be held in facilities that aren't trauma-informed and safe. We're not going to have homeless shelters where women and children don't feel safe so that they can get up back on their feet. We're not going to have women and men exiting juvenile justice facilities and DCFS facilities to homelessness. We're not going to allow adults that have been harmed and mentally ill to exit jails and prisons without the right supports in this community. It's our voices collectively that can change what happens here. This is a beautiful state, an amazing, resilient state with more volunteerism than just about any other state in the United States. We can do this with all of our collective voices. Thank you for letting me be here.